Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's podcast. Our ICANN statement for today is I can summarize the important debates of the Constitutional Convention. As you're following along over today's podcast, be sure to follow along with your unit sheet. Be sure to look at your rubric and your key terms and make sure you're taking notes and writing down anything that you feel like you need to know. The Constitutional Convention opened on May 25th, 1787. Every state except Rhode Island sent representatives. They called these representatives delegates. Even at the time, it was considered a gathering of extremely important, respected, and intelligent people. There's a lot of newspaper stories from the time that were written in Philadelphia where the convention occurred of people that didn't really know what was going on in the Philadelphia State House. There was just a lot of whisperings about how, oh, that was George Washington, that was General George Washington, or that was Ben Franklin, we hear Ben Franklin's coming. So even at the time, while people didn't know what they were talking about, they knew it was important. It's important to remember that the original goal of the Constitutional Convention wasn't to completely create a new government. It was just to revise or change the Articles of Confederation. They didn't want to completely get rid of it. In fact, some historians argue it wasn't legal for them to completely get rid of it. The Articles of Confederation couldn't be changed that way. However, the delegates, after getting together and discussing some of the problems the government was having, decided that it was going to be impossible to simply revise the articles, and that they were going to have to create a completely new form of government. As we already mentioned, there were a lot of really important people at the Constitutional Convention, including 8 men who had signed the Declaration of Independence. General George Washington was there to represent his home state of Virginia, but he was so well respected by the other members of the convention that when he got there, he was unanimously elected president of the convention. He wasn't yet elected president of the United States, that didn't come until later, but he was just elected president of the convention. You can see in this painting of the convention, Washington sits at a desk in the front of the room and sits kind of up above everybody else. Besides a lot of the older delegates, guys who had been leading in the American country for a very long time, like George Washington or Ben Franklin, there was also a lot of really young new leaders for the United States that were there. Alexander Hamilton was there representing New York, and he completely despised the Articles of Confederation. He was hoping to create a new federal government with a strong central government. There was also James Madison, who was also very young but very intelligent and very well researched. He is often called the father of the Constitution because he took such great notes during the Constitutional Convention. One important person who was not there is Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had written the Declaration of Independence, but after that he began serving as a diplomat and ambassador to France for the United States. So he was in France representing the United States at the time that the convention took place and the Constitution was written. The men at the convention met privately in the Philadelphia State House, or as it is now called Constitution Hall. The windows were sealed to help keep the debate secret, but this made the room extremely hot. Remember, this is before air conditioning. This was in Philadelphia during the summer. Most of the Northerners were wearing heavy woolen suits, so it was extremely, extremely hot and very uncomfortable for the delegates, who often worked there for long hours into the night. One of the things that the delegates decided very quickly is that any new government would need a separation of powers, or separate branches of the government. They knew one of their problems was that they currently had a legislative branch, a Congress that could make laws, but they had no executive branch to enforce the laws or serve as the head of the government, such as when they were negotiating with other countries. They had no president or no leader. They also didn't have a judicial branch to settle disputes between states and serve as a federal court system. Because all of the men that were there agreed that the Articles of Confederation was too weak, these men didn't really argue over these 3 different branches of government. They knew that they needed an executive branch, and they knew that they needed a judicial branch, along with a slightly more powerful legislative branch. They just didn't know how powerful they were going to make it. Because they were worried about any one branch getting too powerful, each one of the 3 branches was given a separate set of checks and balances that they could use over one another. For example, any law made by the legislative branch must first be approved by the executive branch or the president, although the legislative branch can override it with a 2/3 majority. The judicial branch can then override those laws and declare them unconstitutional, and take that power away from both the presidency and the legislative branch. However, both the executive branch and the legislative branch can check or balance the judicial branch as well. before any judge can be appointed for life to the judicial branch as a Supreme Court judge, a president must nominate that person, and then the legislative branch, Congress, must approve that nomination to the judicial branch. So all three of the different branches of government have ways of checking and balancing each other. While there wasn't a lot of arguing over the judicial branch, or a lot of arguing at first about the executive branch, right from the beginning of the convention there was a ton of arguing about the legislative branch. The large states and the small states really disagreed about how that legislative branch or Congress was going to be made up. For starters, the large states, or the Virginia Plan, wanted 3 branches of government, and they wanted a 2-house legislature, but both of those houses would be based on population. So they might have a Senate and a House of Representatives like we do now, except both of them would be based on population. So the states that had the biggest population were going to get the most say in Congress. The big states that had a huge population obviously really liked this. The small states, however, represented by the New Jersey Plan, also wanted 3 branches of government. But instead, they wanted a 1-house legislature with each state receiving 1 vote. So each state would be created very equally. This was more fair to the small states who didn't have the population, such as New Jersey that didn't have nearly the population that Virginia did. However, Virginia argued that it wasn't fair to the American people. They argued that because they had a larger population, they knew better what the American people wanted than New Jersey did. New Jersey argued back that the big states would be able to do whatever they wanted in Congress, and that the small states would be better off leaving the United States and joining their own country. Now, this was the biggest debate of the Constitutional Convention, and for a while it looked like it would actually end the Constitutional Convention, and everybody would be stuck living with the Articles of Confederation, or leaving to join their own country, or just become their own independent states. However, Roger Sherman of Connecticut devised a plan that was going to make everybody happy. His plan called for an executive branch and a judicial branch, just like the other plans, but he also wanted a 2-house legislature. One of those 2 houses, the House of Representatives, would be based on population, just like the Virginia Plan wanted. So the bigger states got their way in the House of Representatives. The other house, called the Senate, would be based on each state receiving an equal number of votes. That way, the small states got what they wanted. Sherman's plan became known as the Great Compromise, because without it, the Constitutional Convention would have been over, and maybe even the entire United States. In the Great Compromise, the small states get what they wanted. The large states would never be able to just override them and ignore them, because before something could become a law, it would have to pass through the Senate. The Virginia Plan got what they wanted also for the large states, because one of the houses would be based on population, so that the states with the most population would have a part in Congress. Therefore, the small states wouldn't be able to do whatever they wanted. Large states versus small states wasn't the only debate at the Constitutional Convention, however. Once they decided that one of the houses would be based on population, the southern states, or slave states, spoke up and argued that slaves should count towards population. The northern states argued back that just because you have slaves in your state doesn't mean they count towards population, because you're not letting them vote in elections. Therefore, they shouldn't count. In the end, they settled on what became known as the 3/5 Compromise. 3 out of every 5 slaves would count towards a state's population. There were other debates about slavery too. Even though everybody always thinks about the Civil War and slavery, they were actually arguing about slavery between the northern states and the southern states all the way back at the Constitutional Convention, 70 years before the Civil War. The northern states wanted to outlaw the slave trade and make it illegal to buy and sell humans, or buy and sell slaves, in the United States. Southern states didn't want that. They actually ended up settling the debate by Congress agreeing that they would not make any law about the slave trade for at least 20 years. When those 20 years passed, though, they did outlaw the slave trade. It's important to remember, though, Congress only outlawed the slave trade, not slavery by itself. So slavery was still legal, it just wasn't legal to buy and sell slaves. The delegates had other debates too. They argued about whether or not members of Congress should be paid, or how long the president should serve. Some people argued that the president should be allowed to serve for life, but Ben Franklin argued, well, what happens if you get stuck with a terrible president then? He could be there forever. For nearly 4 months, an entire summer, The delegates argued and debated all of these issues surrounding the Constitution, such as how many people should be on the Supreme Court, how much power should the president have, even what should be the president's official title. At the end of those 4 months, however, in September of 1787, the minute the convention finally finished the Constitution. Ben Franklin, who was very old at this point, had a hard time standing, slowly rose, and everybody got very quiet. He then asked that if people still had any doubts about this Constitution, that they please put those doubts to the side and sign this, because he doubted that anybody anywhere could ever create a better form of government than the one that they just had. All but 3 of the delegates agreed to sign, but some of them were a little bit afraid of it, though. They feared that the new Constitution gave too much power to the federal government and not enough power to the state governments. Each state was to hold a convention and decide whether or not they wanted to approve or reject the new Constitution, but once 9 of the 13 states had ratified it, it would go into effect. The new Constitution was very different from the old Articles of Confederation, which, as you know, had a lot of weaknesses. Most of the power in the Articles was held by the states. They only had one branch of government, and they had nobody to enforce the laws. So they had no executive branch, they had no court system to settle disputes, they had no system of checks and balances. They also had other problems that we've studied too. Colonial money wasn't worth very much, and they had no military because they had no way of taxing people. So they had no way of paying for a military, even paying for roads to transport things. The new Constitution, though, gave a lot more power to the federal government. It had an executive branch to enforce laws, and it had a judicial branch to settle the dispute between states, and it had a way for the federal government to tax its citizens. So in a lot of ways, it solved all of the problems of the Articles of Confederation. Once combined with the new Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, this laid out the framework for our government and the rights that we have as citizens. The new Constitution created a federal government. This is a combination of powers between the national government, in which all of the states are represented, and the individual states' governments. This idea really, really scared a lot of the delegates that were there and a lot of United States citizens at the time. They really didn't like the word national. They didn't want to give power away from their states and give it to a central government. So a lot of the delegates preferred to use the word federal, which means shared between the two. Now that we've reached the end of our podcast, go back over your key terms on your objective sheet. Make sure that you have a 5-word definition down for each of those key terms, and then look at the review questions here. There are 6 of them, and make sure that you answer each of those 6 questions. If you can't answer those questions and you can't answer them in oral defense, then you may need to go back through the podcast or check your notes and maybe write down the answers to those questions as you're watching it a second time. When you think you have all of the answers to the review questions and you have a 5-word definition to each of the key terms, then you need to go to work on your other assignments. Be sure to look at your rubric and make sure you know exactly where you fall in the rubric. Remember, you should be able to do everything in level 2 and everything in level 3 by the end of this podcast. If not, feel free to rewind and keep listening and make sure you update your notes.